Firstly, let me just say what a privilege it is to actually be speaking here today. As Marty said, it was this very service a year ago that we first walked in those doors. And we knew from the very moment that we walked in, we literally can picture it now, came in there, we knew that this was the place for our family. We'd moved up here and we're looking around for a church, and instantly we just knew. We were welcomed straight away and overwhelmed by how genuinely friendly and authentic everyone was. And it reminded us so much of the church from when we were youth pastors when we first got married, that it was very similar look and similar people. It was like going back 20 years. It was amazing. Thank you. We're very glad to be here. So today is Mother's Day. It's a beautiful day to celebrate, but also it's not for everyone. Just days before Mother's Day, 19 years ago yesterday, and 15 years ago last Monday, I was on my way to becoming mother when I miscarried at 10 and a half weeks with Benjamin and 6 and a half weeks with Eden Grace. Commercialism and Hallmark cards, they don't really take real life situations into account when it's all about just celebrating one aspect of humanity. So if today is not a day of celebration for you, that's okay, I get it. And if you're struggling today and you're hoping that this would be your year, if you've struggled to become a mum, can I encourage you not to give up hope? Even though you might feel like that you're in the darkest hole and you can't see a way out, let me encourage you that God does have a plan. It's often quite different from what we think it should look like, but his plan is always better. He sees things from a very different perspective. I could have never have imagined in those dark days of unimaginable sadness that good could come out of those two lives who are now growing up in heaven. But their story has now been read in 8 different countries and by countless grieving parents. In Isaiah 55, verse 8 to 9, it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So today, I want to introduce what I'm talking about by learning about a word in the Bible. It's mentioned 74 times in the Bible, 3 times in Habakkuk, and 71 times in Psalms. So when something's mentioned that many times, it's there for a reason. It's worth taking notice of why. The word is Selah. It's mentioned so many times in Psalms when a whole lot of stuff had been said, and then Selah. And we can often brush past that word, not really knowing and just keeping on going. But it was a deliberate pause, a deliberate drawing attention to what had just been said. It was often a musical term, time for all the instruments and the voices to just stop and focus on maybe a solo or one instrument or one voice. Our worlds are so busy and noisy that sometimes we need to remember to stop and listen. There is no exact definition of Selah, but the meaning that I've gathered from it is stop, listen, pause, think, and consider. Selah is a form of worship. Pausing is just as powerful and necessary as doing. It's in the Psalms for a reason. So how do we implement this into our daily lives, and what happens when we do? Instead of seeing a situation at face value, take a moment to think about it and consider what else might actually be going on. What happens when we live life through the lens of Selah? How do we see situations differently when we apply Selah to them? Are we more sympathetic to other people when we filter their words and their actions through it? What do we notice when we read the Bible with the concept of Selah? To live life considering it is to live a life of worship. Worship is described as the feeling or expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. So what does that look like? It's not limited to music. We often think of the word worship and we think music, but it is so much more than that. Music is just one expression of worship. I've been part of church worship teams since I was 12, playing flute, piano, singing, camera crew, all the different things. But those things are just tools to express the worship from within. Over the past few years, I've got into photography. It's provided another opportunity to express worship, to draw attention to God's creation. The camera has just become like another instrument to me. It's about seeing the big picture, but also noticing the detail. And what I love about photography is that it has the ability to pause life. So for me, one of the most incredible things is to see an epic sunrise over the ocean, but my only problem with that is that it disappears so quickly. It happens at crazy o'clock in the morning, which my boys don't appreciate being dragged out of bed for. So with a camera, I can capture that moment in time and share God's creation to everyone who didn't get up at crazy o'clock. I can press pause on that moment and appreciate it for what it is. And then being able to share those images is a form of worship. It's drawing attention to God's artistry, how he can create something unique every single day. I took this photo during lockdown in 2020. Now, lockdown really forced people to look at things with a different perspective. This might look like a beautiful plant, but the reality is that was a weed growing out the back of a house near the washing line and the retaining wall. But when we focus on that one thing, we see it very differently. So instead of seeing overgrown weeds, we notice its beauty after the rain, the way its delicate stems hold the raindrops, and how incredibly detailed they are, and each one is unique. God made them. Appreciate them. Realise that if he put that much thought and effort into designing a weed or a raindrop, how much more value has he placed on you, who are fearfully and wonderfully made? This is worship. When we were in Queensland, New Zealand a few years ago, I remember seeing the huge mountains and just thinking how magnificent they were and the way that God had shaped each one. And it just makes you feel so small when you're in the presence of these incredible mountains. This photo was taken literally outside of the log house that we were staying in. It's just amazing. But in that very same space, I sat there on the beautiful green grass and noticed the last drop of dew delicately hanging on to a little blade of grass as the morning sun started to melt it away. God is in the huge, magnificent things just as much as the tiny details. When you look out at the stars in the sky, slow down enough to appreciate his creation. Many years ago, when I was a travel agent, I remember staying out at Ayers Rock and being in the dead centre of Australia. And being outside at night in those places, the stars are the clearest you can ever see. The silence was deafening. And when you're immersed in nature, God feels so close. He's always close, but when we get rid of the distractions, we see him more clearly. In Psalm 147, verse 4, it says, "He determines the number of the stars and calls them each by name." If he calls each star by name, think how much value he places on you. We sing a song here called 1,000 Hallelujahs, and the first verse says this: "Who else would rocks cry out to worship? Whose glory taught the stars to shine? Perhaps creation longs to have the words to sing, but this joy is mine." Rocks don't have a voice. Stars don't have a mouth. Creation can't speak or sing. God has created us with a mouth that can be used to worship, to sing, to speak about him, to share with others. What a privilege it is that God has created us to be able to do that. My son was playing basketball recently, before he nearly broke his leg, and he said he had the thought how cool it was that God, who created the galaxies and billions of stars and planets, called them by name, was also just as interested in the joy that he got from throwing a rubber ball into a metal ring. That's worship. Having those moments of realising how much God is interested in us and what brings us joy. One of my favourite shells is the power shell. It's found deep on the ocean floor in New Zealand. When divers are searching for it, they don't see something beautiful. They actually see sand-coloured rough shell. They're covered in sand and barnacles, and they just look like a rock. You could pass over them so easily and not even see that they're there. But these divers know that once they clean all this away and they polish it up, they get the most glorious of colours. And each one is unique. There is not one of these exactly the same. Man can't make that. They have to pause. They have to make an effort to uncover the beauty that lies beneath the dirt. They could easily pass by these shells and just think they're rocks. But when they pause and take notice of their surroundings, there is a treasure to be found, often right in front of them if they take the time to pause. So when we stop and listen, pause and think, consider, it turns down the volume of the busyness of our own thoughts and helps us to hear what God wants us to do. Communion, it's a form of Selah. It's a deliberate stopping, reflecting, considering, and remembering what Jesus did when he died on the cross for our sins. It's being reminded of what his actions back then mean for us today and how we live our lives. We're going to take a moment now and we're going to read this psalm that's coming up. And I want you to think about it, think of the words that are here and apply the concept of Selah to it. Look at what stands out to you and then really look at it. What does it mean? What's it really saying? How does that apply to your life today? To me, it sounds a little bit like the state of the world at the moment. In the last couple of years with pandemics, fires, floods, earthquakes, wars, and yet we're reminded to be still and know that he is God. So let's just read through this and just take note, even write it down, a word maybe that stands out to you. Think about what that really means. It says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. There is a river whose stream shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot in the fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. Such a powerful psalm. And we're taking that photo down on the Gold Coast, and it looks like there's rocks tumbling, and you just think all of that going on, but God is in control. So even today and throughout this week, just reflect on that. Think about what it was in there that stood out to you. What is it that you can put into your life? And whenever you hear the news and you get disturbed by seeing all the negativity that's on there, just refer back to this, because that's the truth. In Genesis 2, it says, on the seventh day, God was finished with his work, which he had made. So he rested on the seventh day from all his work, which he'd made. God rested on the seventh day. If God himself saw it necessary to stop, to pause, to reflect, then it must be important for us to do as well. So if we take the concept of Selah, of pausing, resting, considering and taking notice, what does it do when we apply it to how we read the Bible? Are there things we've read that we brush over because we've heard them so many times before, so we don't notice some of those hidden things that maybe we need to look at a bit further? Maybe we need to be like the diver, cleaning away the covering to find the treasure. What does it do when we pray? Maybe it means we listen more than we speak. There are many examples in the Bible of people who listened to God's prompting. It wasn't the most glamorous opportunities. Many of those people aren't even mentioned. But the result of their listening continues to impact our worlds today. If they'd been too busy with the noise and the busyness of their life, they may have missed it. If they hadn't paused, they might have rushed right past. If they didn't Selah, they might not have seen or heard God's prompting. So there's 3 mums in the Bible that I want to draw attention to today. The first is talked about in Genesis 17, 15 to 17. Then God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai. Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. King of peoples shall be from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" It's not an unusual response to laugh at an idea that we can't see any way in our strength of it coming to fruition. But when God tells you to do it, we have to let go of our ideas of how it will happen and trust in his process. We may laugh and doubt, but we still need to obey. In Hebrews 11, verse 11, it says, "By faith, even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive a child, even when she was long past the normal age for it, because she considered him who had given her the promise to be reliable and true to his word." Sarah was barren. She was old. There was no doubt about it. She was well past the usual age for having a child. But God had promised her that she would have a baby. So she trusted in he who promised. Sarah listened to God and trusted him in a situation she had no control over, and it was impossible without God's intervention. Because she considered him who had given her the promise to be reliable and true. Because she considered him. That was the key. Her focus was on God, not on her circumstances or human frailty. Her faith was in God alone. She knew the nature of God to be reliable and true. So when God prompts us to do something and our mind starts racing with all the reasons why we can't do it, how many of those reasons are considering God? And how many are considering ourselves? Her miracle happened because she trusted God, nothing of her own strength. Sometimes we might feel underskilled, underqualified, yet hearing God call us to do something that seems impossible in our eyes, all we have to do is consider him who gave the promise. What has God asked you to do that maybe you're laughing in doubt at the very concept of what he's asked you to do? Are you guilty of looking at your own circumstances and doubting that God can use you? Do you consider yourself underskilled, unqualified, yet you know that God has placed something on your heart, but you're scared to say it out loud? How much of those doubts are about you, and how much trust are you placing in God? Do you need to take some time to Selah, to pause, to consider, and think about what God may be doing? So the second mum I'm going to talk about, we've had some floods here recently, in case you didn't notice. Imagine hearing a story on the news while the Brisbane River was flooding. There was cranes and pontoons and random objects floating down the Brisbane River. And imagine if we heard about this lady who thought, oh, that's nice, I might take my little baby down to the river and have a little play, take the little floaties, that'd be great. And then you wonder why the SES have turned up and the police, and it's just not going well. Not Mother of the Year material. But there is an account of a mum in the Bible who did something similar. When we look at it through the filter of Selah, when we pause and consider. A woman named Jochebed, more commonly known as Moses' mum. And this is what she did. Not exactly the Moses' basket, but it's the concept. We know she had to hide him so he wouldn't be killed. And by sending him down the river, he arrived to Pharaoh's house, and she ended up being able to look after him. We know how the story ended, and we know the great life that Moses then got to live out because he wasn't killed. But let's apply Selah to this story. Pause and consider being that mum. Imagine being told that he would be killed. Imagine having to hide him away, living in fear that he would be discovered. For the first 3 months of his life, she was able to hide him. But as he grew bigger, he got louder, and it became harder to hide him. If you've ever had a newborn, you know how hard it is to keep him quiet. The fear she must have felt every night as her village grew quiet, yet her baby continued to wake throughout the night, and with every cry, she wondered if her cover would be blown. Then imagine being so fearful of his discovery that putting him into a croc-infested river was the safer choice. She made a basket, she coated it, and floated it down the river. That took an incredible amount of fear and courage all mixed into one. Sometimes we're in situations where we feel like it's the worst case scenario. It feels like there is no way out and there is no good option available. So we have to trust God. It's all we can do. Trusting God is always the best option, but our human nature tends to leave that as a last resort, and we try to figure things out on our own, and we leave God for later. But we don't see how the story pans out. We don't see the rescue that is coming. We don't see the future that will happen because of that choice. We need to pause and consider what God is doing in that situation. Most of us will never have to resort to putting our baby into a croc-infested river and floating him towards the very person that wants him killed. But maybe we'll be asked to let go of something else. Maybe there's something else so precious to us that we're hanging on tight to it, fearful it will be taken, even though we know that actually letting it go will allow it to come alive and achieve its goal. What if Moses had escaped death but never ended up in Pharaoh's house? What would that have meant for the future of the Israelites? Is there something you're holding on to too tightly? Is it a job you know that isn't right for you, but you're scared to let it go? Is it relationships with people who might not be the best for you? Is it a habit you know that isn't good for you, but you're scared of how you'll cope if you give it up? As a mum, Jochebed had to let her child go, many years earlier than most mums would ever expect to do. But she had his best interests at heart, and by trusting God, she knew that God would take care of him and had a greater future for Moses than she could ever imagine. Being a parent is a constant battle of being torn between protecting our children, yet at the same time having to let them go, try new things, take risks. We know that they might get hurt, but they'll also grow, and maybe they'll float down the river to their destiny. What's in your life that maybe you need to put into a basket? What do you need to trust God with to believe that he is at the end of the river with something much better than you could imagine? The last mum that I want to talk about is someone whose name we don't even know. But the story of feeding the 5,000 has been told throughout all time. Most people know of this story, and they know a miracle took place when Jesus took a small amount of food and turned it into so much that there was leftovers. Matthew 14, verse 18, it said, "Bring them here to me." He commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples. And the disciples gave to the multitudes. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets of all the fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So there's a couple of other miracles that I noticed in that story. Firstly, a boy gave up his lunch. I've got 2 teenage boys. They don't give up their lunch. They like to eat. I spend my weekends grocery shopping and bulk cooking and slow cookers. This is my weekend. That's what that looks like. The other miracle is a little bit less obvious. We don't know the boy's name, but whoever he was, he had a mum. We could safely assume that on the morning that that boy went out to hear Jesus speak, his mum had packed him a lunch. I don't think she had Aldi or a slow cooker. Don't think she had Woolies delivery, but she did what she did to provide for her son and send him out for the day. This was probably not the first time that she'd done this. I'm sure she regularly made meals for him and sent him out with food. She wasn't celebrated for this. She wasn't honoured in her village, being this amazing mum that fed her child. She just did what needed to be done to feed her son. It was mundane, it was not glamorous, it was repetitive. I wonder if she ever questioned what she did each day was good enough, whether it had any meaning, whether it would make an impact on the world. I wonder if she ever wished that she could go out to hear Jesus speak. I wonder if she felt tired and unnoticed. Did she feel like she was missing out while everyone else got to go and hear the speaker? One thing I'm sure of, I bet she never expected that a miracle could come from her lunchbox. I wonder if she ever heard what even happened from her son's lunch. Or did he come home and just not even mention it? Or was it still in his bag after the holidays? I have a friend very similar to this mum. She's got 5 kids. She is very much in the depths of nappies, teenagers, lunches, everything. Homework, the lot, and cooking lots of food. She won't be honoured on a Hallmark card, but the kids that she is raising are loved, nurtured, well-fed, and impacting their worlds because of her. And sometimes I think with the amount of cooking that she does, that she could probably feed the 5,000 too. Something Jesus did that can often be looked over. He took the loaves and fish and he looked up to heaven and he said a blessing. The blessing wasn't about making the food anything special. It was about acknowledging and thanking God, who was about to use the food for a miracle. We might have something similar in our hands, an opportunity that really doesn't look like much. But when we give it to God, he blesses it. Watch it become a miracle. Don't ever think that God has forgotten you, leaving you in the mundane, unglamorous tasks of your life. He's watching you. Be faithful in the little, so you can be faithful in much. Maybe you're the mum at home with kids, doing the thankless, mundane tasks of everyday life. Maybe you're doing a job that doesn't seem glamorous or appreciated. You're being faithful and diligent. Maybe you have a goal that you're committed to, and the end result seems so far off, yet you're committed to stay focused. Maybe it's deliberately being friendly to that person at school or at work who normally gets left out and making sure that they're included. God is in the everyday. He's in everything you do. Choose to have him at the centre of everything. Acknowledge him and watch what he does with it. Because in the story of feeding the 5,000, it's easy to get caught up in focusing on the food. But really, the food had nothing to do with it. The bread and fish were everyday common items at the time. There was nothing special about them. They were common. The miracle wasn't in the food. The miracle was about God who multiplied it. The miracle was about God taking something that is an everyday, normal, common thing and showing us what can be done when we give our normal to God. It's about glorifying God who can work through us, regardless of how unqualified we think we are. So when we give our normal to God and allow him to use it, it glorifies him, which is worship. It draws attention to him. If our everyday lives are focused on drawing attention to him, then everything we do becomes an act of worship. And when everything becomes an act of worship, our whole perspective changes. So what is in our hands? What are we currently doing that we may think is not much, but if we give it to God, he can multiply it and make something miraculous out of it? If we pause, we consider, we notice things that we may not have seen before. We see people as God sees them, not as we do. So this week, start to apply Selah to your life. At home, at work, at school, when listening to others, when praying, when you're just doing life. This week, start to just stop and listen. Pause, think, consider. Take time to deliberately practice Selah. So as the worship team come, apply Selah to what we're about to sing. Think about the words, really think about them. Find meaning in what you sing, and you'll find you'll truly worship.